After the end of World War II, a new conflict emerged known as the Cold War. This battle pitted the world's two great powers, the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union, against each other. Though the Cold War is more famously known as a time of military superiority, the space race would often become another dramatic arena for this competition, and each side sought to prove superiority in its scientific technology systems. The space race was just another ingredient in the competition between the US and Soviet Union to prove to the world which country is more successful, and more specifically, capitalism or communism. Rather than using strategies and tactics of other world wars to prove which country is better, they turned to innovation to prove their superiority. Triumphs of these two 20th century Cold War rivals prove that there are no limits to science and engineering. However, in spite of the great things that were accomplished in the space race, we tend to forget the corrupt and inhumane practice performed on both sides. To understand the space race and the key figures involved, we must go to the beginning. Modern rocket science and engineering actually began in the early 1900s with an American physicist by the name of Robert Goddard. Goddard began researching rockets powered by liquid fuel and eventually launched his first rocket in 1926. His first liquid fuel powered rocket only traveled about 184 feet. This, however, was the start of something very new in this world. Goddard's work was first recreated by the Germans at the height of World War II, when a man named Wernher von Braun created the V-2 missile. This missile was used to fire bombs at Britain and Belgium from very long distances. This was done to generate a more effective war campaign since bombs were dropped from the skies with aircraft over enemy territory. As this technology improved and increased distances, America knew they needed this rocket on their side, especially with their new invention of the atom bomb. This technology was later put towards much better use after the war ended, when von Braun took his knowledge and talents to the United States of America and became one of the key engineers of space exploration. The Soviets were also developing and testing their own rocket technology. On the Soviet side of the space race was engineer Sergei Korolev. He is known by many as the father of practical aeronautics. Like many of his colleagues, Korolev was originally imprisoned in the Soviet gulags. He was imprisoned for illegally using the government funds to support his own private rocket advancements. As part of his release from prison, he continued to work on aeronautic science. He proved to be what the Soviets needed for the space innovation and was instrumental in making the Soviets the first space-faring nation. He was so critical to the Soviet space program that they kept his identity secret until his death, the opening shot, Sputnik.
CBS Television presents a special report on Sputnik 1, the Soviet space satellite. Douglas Edwards reporting.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik, the first man-made satellite as it passed over New York earlier today.
On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. This small satellite, just only 20 inches in diameter, would change the course of history forever. The Soviets' triumphs continued on November 3rd, 1957, when they launched Sputnik 2, carrying Laika the stray dog. Laika was the first living organism to ever enter space. This triumph turned into tragedy when Laika was burned alive in the rocket during its descent back to Earth. The Soviets did not plan for the heat associated with the descent of the satellite back into the Earth's atmosphere. The U.S., operating in a panic, fired their own satellite into space, Explorer 1, on January 31st, 1958. At this point, the United States were uncertain that they could ever even keep up with the Soviets. With this, the U.S. officially entered the space race, and the government funded a new agency called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or more commonly known as NASA. On April 12, 1961, America was hit with yet again another surprise. The Soviets had put the first man in space. This man was Yuri Gagarin, a cosmonaut for the Soviet Union. Cosmonauts are Russian astronauts trained to command spacecrafts. In an interview after his historic flight, he said, "I'm immensely glad that my beloved fatherland was the first in history to penetrate the cosmos. The first airplane, the first satellite, the first cosmic spaceship, and the first manned flight into space. These are the stages on the great road of my fatherland towards the conquest of the mysteries of nature." The Soviet Union was on top, and the US was not to be outdone. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American to enter space aboard the Freedom 7 spacecraft. And less than a year later, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth on February 20, 1962. In response to the Soviet success, President John F. Kennedy gave the most important speeches in American history. In that speech on September 12, 1962, he said that the United States will put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. JFK's speech was a game changer in the space race. Suddenly, the focus of the space race changed from putting a man in space to a man on the moon. Both countries worked feverishly and funded new programs to make it to the moon. The US started the Apollo program, and the Soviets started the Soyuz program. On January 27, 1967, America had launched their first spacecraft in the Apollo program. This is Apollo 1. With expectation to gain research on the flight that would eventually put man on the moon, through triumph was the goal, tragedy struck the Apollo program. The 3 astronauts were tragically burned alive in the cockpit due to a launch failure, and this tragedy almost shut down the Apollo program for good. NASA recovered from tragedy and successfully launched more Apollo explorations. But it was Apollo 11 who would make history. Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were aboard the Saturn V spacecraft, and on July 20, 1969, with more than 500 million people watching live, Neil Armstrong became the first man to step foot on the moon. This put America back on top and was truly a century-defining moment.
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon. On this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
Less than a year later, Apollo 13 launched. Everything went as planned on the mission. However, on a routine check, there was an explosion on the exterior of the spacecraft, causing them to lose power and oxygen. The odds were not in their favor, and tragedy seemed inevitable. But they pulled off a miracle by fixing their air purifier with duct tape and plastic bags, and made an emergency turnaround around the moon in a freezing cabin, and all 3 men survived. The Apollo missions would be the last major events of the space race between the US and the Soviets. The Soviet space program fell apart due to lack of government funding and failing to keep up with the US lunar program. The space race would see its end on July 17, 1975, during the Apollo-Soyuz docking. An American Apollo module docked with a Soviet Soyuz module, ending tensions in the space race, and was also the final flight of any Apollo spacecraft. The space race proved that humans are capable of reaching unthinkable heights. We may never get to see anything like the space race again. However, the space race pushed many new advancements we live with every day, like satellites. By the time of the moon landing, Americans were paying around $25 annually to NASA, and in today's money it's equivalent to $200 each year from each American. That would give an annual $65 billion to work with. But today, NASA only gets about $20.7 billion annual budget, which is only about 0.4% of the United States annual budget. Without the advancements made during the space race, the world's space exploration may never have been able to be what it is today. Unfortunately, there are many tragedies within all these triumphs, and hundreds of workers and astronauts died within these missions. Sadly, many of these deaths were kept in the shadows to keep support of citizens. With the fall of the Soviet Union, it uncovered many untold deaths of people involved in the space race, and many more still kept away in the shadows. The space race was truly one of the greatest triumphs of the 20th century. And in an interview with the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong,
it was the ultimate peaceful competition. USA versus USSR. I'll not assert that it was a diversion which prevented a war. Nonetheless, it was a diversion. It was intense, and it did allow to both sides to take the high road with the objectives of science and learning and exploration. Eventually, it provided a mechanism for engendering cooperation between former adversaries. In that sense, among others, it was an exceptional national investment for both sides.